with no name, with supernatural skill, on a mission of revenge. Ruthless assassins, and reach the enemy he has sworn to defeat.
Hero, 2002, a complete analysis and explanation. The following text constitutes a complete, in-depth analysis and explanation of the entire film Hero, directed by Zhang Yimou. Hero is not merely a martial arts film. It is a complex tapestry of philosophy, visual poetry, and political allegory, woven together through a groundbreaking narrative structure. The film, set during the Warring States period before the unification of China, uses the legendary assassination attempts on the King of Qin as a framework to explore the very nature of truth, storytelling, and the cost of peace. Its genius lies in its ability to function simultaneously as a breathtaking wuxia spectacle and a profound philosophical debate. The film's narrative engine is a Rashomon-style investigation into a single event. The prefect Nameless claimed to have killed 3 legendary assassins. This structure immediately announces that objective truth is not the film's primary concern. Instead, it posits that truth is a malleable substance, colored by the perspective, emotions, and political necessities of the teller. Each version of the story is a self-contained argument, visually and thematically distinct, forcing the audience to constantly reevaluate what they have seen and who they trust. The opening sequence establishes the film's core aesthetic and political reality. The monolithic, gray-black Qin palace represents absolute, centralized power. The King of Qin sits alone, a terrifying and isolated figure, surrounded by thousands of terracotta-like attendants and an endless void of dark stone. This visual desolation is not just a setting. It is a psychological portrait of tyranny, a world where power is absolute but trust is non-existent, and every shadow holds a potential knife. Nameless' arrival is an act of profound spatial and political transgression. He is brought before the king, but must remain 100 paces away, a distance that defines the sovereign's paranoia. The emperor's decree that anyone from the state of Zhao must remain at least 10 paces further back is a brilliant narrative detail, instantly establishing the deep-seated regional hatreds that fuel the warring states' chaos and foreshadowing the central conflict between personal, regional loyalty and the dream of a unified empire. The three boxes Nameless presents, containing the legendary weapons of Sky, Flying Snow, and Broken Sword, are coffins of reputation. They are symbolic caskets that supposedly contain the death of Descent. The king's permission for Nameless to approach to 10 paces is the inciting event that transforms the entire film into a pressure cooker. Every subsequent story, every flashback, every color-drenched memory is a gambit to manipulate or reveal the truth within those fatal 10 paces. The first story, told by Nameless and belonging to the color red, is a tale of passion, jealousy, and martial honor. He claims to have defeated Long Sky, the spear-wielding assassin, in a rain-drenched gaming house. This fight, with its blinding sheet of water droplets slowing time itself, is not a mere action scene but a symphony of perception. The water represents a transparent, clear-cut truth, yet the very fact that this truth is recounted as a memory within a lie sets the stage for the film's central thesis. All perception is filtered. Nameless' account of his journey to a besieged Zhao calligraphy school solidifies the red narrative's theme of overwhelming emotion. Red is the color of the Zhao state's enduring spirit, but it is also the color of blood, lust, and fiery retribution. The Qin army's relentless volleys of black arrows against the red-clad scholars are a visual metaphor for the state's brutal assault on intellectual and cultural independence. The stubbornness of the calligrapher who keeps practicing, even as the arrows rain down, is a romantic, idealized version of defiance, beautiful, tragic, but ultimately futile. Within this crimson-tinged fiction, Nameless paints Broken Sword and Flying Snow's relationship as a tempest of sexual betrayal and recrimination. Flying Snow's staged affair with her servant, physically incarnated by the magnificent Maggie Cheung, is a performance of such intense, silent rage that it communicates more than dialogue ever could. The red fabric that drapes their bodies and the room is a visual manifestation of their trapped, burning desires, a prison of passion that Nameless expertly exploits. The fight between Flying Snow and the servant moon, choreographed amidst a swirling sea of autumnal leaves, is one of cinema's most stunning visual elegies. The deep red and brilliant gold leaves are not just beautiful. They are the dying embers of a love triangle, a whirlwind of fury and grief. The swordswomen's identical red robes blur their identities, suggesting they are two halves of a single broken heart, driven to a duel to the death by the manipulations of men and the unendurable pain of betrayal. The King of Qin's immediate dismissal of Nameless' story is a pivotal moment of intelligence that elevates him above a simple tyrant. He deconstructs the tale with the cold logic of a statesman who understands the psychology of his enemies intimately. He knows Sky, Snow, and Sword are not merely warriors but souls of transcendent skill and character, incapable of succumbing to such petty, passion-driven squabbles. This act of reinterpretation transforms the king from a passive listener into an active co-author of the narrative. The king's version, drenched in a serene and mournful blue, is a story of heroic sacrifice. He proposes that the three assassins willingly gave their lives in a grand conspiracy to place Nameless within 10 paces. This shift from crimson rage to blue ideation is total. The frantic, individualistic emotions of the red story give way to a measured collective goal. The blue color palette drains the heat of passion, replacing it with the cool, calculated resolve of martyrs walking toward their fate with open eyes. In the blue-tinted lake battle between Nameless and Long Sky, water again takes on a symbolic meaning. But this time it is not a rain of chance, but a mirror of the soul. They fight not on the water's surface, but inside its spirit, floating in a space of mutual respect. When Sky falls, his spear swiping across a droplet in an impossible act of final grace, the king's narrative suggests that his death was not a defeat but a conscious, noble gift, an idea as fluid and pure as the water itself. The conceptual pivot of the blue story is the sword calligraphy scroll. The king understands that a warrior of Broken Sword's caliber would not seek a scroll for martial technique. He correctly posits that the true meaning of the character Sword has evolved for sword, much like the king's own vision. The supreme art is not that of a murderous dagger, but of a unifying way. The scroll becomes a diplomatic message, a shared philosophy between the two greatest minds of the age, the artist and the emperor. The tragic heart of the blue version is the fatal dispute between Flying Snow and Broken Sword. It is not a quarrel of infidelity, but a profound ideological clash over which life is worth sacrificing. The fight, a ballet of ethereal grace in a mountain lake, ends with Flying Snow's mortal wounding at the hands of her lover. The king's narrative envisions a sacrifice born not of jealousy, but of a brutal, necessary love for the cause. This reinterpretation flatters Nameless and casts the assassins as grand, tragic heroes in a saga of unification. Nameless then shatters both narratives by confessing the king is a step closer to the truth, but fails to grasp the most crucial element, the heart of Broken Sword. This leads to the third white-hued story, the film's philosophical and emotional epicenter. White is the color of truth stripped bare, of death, and of ultimate clarity. In this pristine desert landscape devoid of color's distractions, the rawest ideological conflict is fought not with swords, but with brush and ink. The 3-year flashback within the White story is the film's secret origin. The king's earlier suspicion that the assassins could have killed him at any time is proven devastatingly correct. The flashback reveals Broken Sword and Flying Snow's effortless, ghost-like infiltration of the Qin Palace, a silent massacre of thousands of guards that demonstrates their near-divine power. This sequence reframes the entire political landscape. The king's survival was never a matter of security, but a choice made by a single man's conscience. Broken Sword's epiphany in the throne room is a moment of shattering moral complexity. He has the tyrant dead to rights, yet he cannot strike. He recognizes in the king not just a murderer, but the only force powerful and ruthless enough to end the centuries-long slaughter of the warring states. His decision to walk away is an act of supreme betrayal against his lover, his clan, and his nation of Zhao in service of a higher, abstract concept. All under heaven, Tianxia. The character of Nameless embodies the journey from personal grievance to a transpersonal understanding of history. He arrives at the palace as a man of Zhao, his parents having been killed by Qin soldiers, his identity forged in the crucible of vengeance. The film charts his spiritual education at the hands of Broken Sword's philosophy. He is the everyman, the conduit for the audience, who must process and ultimately accept the cold, terrible logic that a lasting peace can only be born from a mountain of skulls. Jet Li's performance as Nameless is a masterclass in minimalist acting. In a role that requires him to be a cipher in his own tales and a listener in others, he conveys a monumental internal shift through the smallest changes in posture and gaze. The true action of the film is not the swordplay, but the war behind his eyes as family vengeance collides with philosophical enlightenment. His stillness is his strength. He is a vessel slowly being emptied of hate and filled with a sorrowful understanding of necessity. Tony Leung Chiu-Wai's Broken Sword is the broken heart of the film, a man torn between the sword of personal love and the calligraphy brush of civilizational vision. His character represents the artist-warrior archetype in its most tragic form. He has the power to change the world through violence, but chooses the path of intellectual and moral influence, a choice that costs him his lover's respect and ultimately his life. His performance is a symphony of suppressed agony and transcendent insight. Maggie Cheung's Flying Snow is the human cost of grand political theory, the embodiment of a pure, unyielding love that cannot be subordinated to abstract ideals. She represents loyalty in its most elemental form, not to a land or a king, but to the memories of a homeland and the word of her lover. Her inability to forgive Broken Sword's philosophical defection is not framed as a failure of understanding, but as a noble, tragically human commitment to the primacy of personal truth. Her grief is a force of nature. The philosophical climax is delivered not with a sword strike, but with a calligraphy brush. Broken Sword inscribes the two characters for all under heaven, Tenta, in the sand, and the earth bears witness. This act is a silent, devastating argument that the concept of a unified China transcends any individual life, any single kingdom's sovereignty, or any king's brutality. The sword has finally become the brush. The warrior has become a philosopher king in spirit, passing this bitter wisdom to Nameless. Nameless' return to the Qin Palace's present-tense blackness is not a return to a lie, but a descent from the enlightened White Peak back into the brutal realm of political reality. The revelation of his 10-pace, perfect strike technique, where a single strike is so precise it ensures death within a time frame the victim cannot even perceive, raises the stakes to an unbearable pitch. The film's suspense is no longer about a physical fight, but a philosophical standoff. Will Nameless kill the King of Qin? The king's reaction upon hearing Broken Sword's revelation is perhaps the film's most surprising moment. The tyrant weeps. He is not weeping for himself or his safety, but because he has finally, and for the first time, been understood. A man who has spent his life as a hated monster, surrounded by paranoia, discovers that his greatest enemy has seen through the bloodshed to the possible future it could buy. The king's tears are for the loneliness of his own terrible vocation, finally shared. Nameless' choice to spare the king is not an act of submission or brainwashing. It is a final, self-willed act of supreme agency. He performs the ultimate sacrifice. He abandons his life's meaning, revenge, to accept a larger meaning, peace. He drops his sword not in defeat, but in a profound, heartbreaking acceptance that the king's death would plunge the realm back into an endless, bloody scrum of warring states. His personal pain is subsumed into a cosmic, historical necessity. The legal and political aftermath of Nameless' choice is presented with devastating, dialectical precision. The king, now a convert to Broken Sword's philosophy, makes his own agonizing choice. He orders Nameless' execution not out of malice, but to uphold the absolute, impersonal law of the Qin state, the very mechanism that will enforce the future peace. It is a final, grim lesson. The unity of all under heaven requires the death of a hero, a sacrifice to the god of legalist order. The execution of Nameless is not a defeat, but a canonization. The film stages it as a hero's funeral, a wall of black arrows blotting out the sky, leaving his figure a void in the palace gate. He is not strung up like a criminal, but honored with a grave. The state must kill the man to sanctify his idea. The individual who could have shattered the machine chooses to become a part of it, a foundational myth, a ghost in the architecture of the new empire. The parallel tragedy of Flying Snow and Broken Sword provides the emotional closure that the political finale deliberately withholds. Returning to the White Desert, their final confrontation is a piece of pure, poetic grief. Flying Snow, her life's purpose shattered twice. First by her lover's refusal to kill the king, and now by his philosophical corruption of their would-be successor, confronts Sword. Her rage is not for herself, but for the death of the simple, romantic world she inhabited. Broken Sword's refusal to defend himself in the final duel with Flying Snow is his ultimate act of love. He has lived a life of ideological turmoil, but in death he can offer her a final, undeniable proof of his devotion. He lets her sword run him through, an act of sacrificial atonement for the sin of putting an idea above her heart. His death is an apology, a final gift of a clean, unquestionable act in a life muddied by abstract, conceptual betrayals. Flying Snow's suicide is the film's most devastatingly beautiful image of absolute fidelity. Finding that Broken Sword did not pull his sword, she is overcome by a grief so profound it is almost holy. She does not need to live in a world without him, a world where the cause was lost. Her sword, turned upon herself and her body draped over his, cements their love as a legend that will echo alongside, but entirely separate from, the political legend of Nameless. The sweeping cinematography of Christopher Doyle is the film's primary narrator, a visual language so potent it renders subtitles almost redundant. Doyle paints with light and landscape, from the claustrophobic obsidian architecture of the Qin court to the majestic, wind-swept plateaus of the Gobi Desert. Every frame is a composition of texture, from the rough grain of ancient wood to the liquid silk of warriors' robes, creating a synesthetic experience that turns the film into a living, breathing painting. The color theory of Hero is its most famous and most critically analyzed formal element. The 5 elemental colors, black, red, blue, green, and white, are not arbitrary aesthetic choices but a rigorous semantic system. Black is the water element and the north, the domain of Qin's absolute power. Red is fire and the south, the pulsing rage of the Zhao heart. Blue is wood and the east, the intellectual coolness of the king's speculation. White is metal and the west, the unadorned, lethal, ultimate truth of sacrifice. Green is reserved for a flashback of youthful potential. The use of white in the definitive truth sequence is particularly philosophically charged. White in Chinese aesthetics is not a blank slate, but the color of mourning and the culmination of all colors. In this section, the characters' white robes drain them of regional identity, nationhood, and personal history, reducing them to pure, abstract philosophical positions. The White Desert is a clean page upon which the final argument for Tianxia is written in blood and tears. The fight choreography by Tony Ching's Shu Tung rejects mundane physics in favor of poetic metaphysics. The martial arts are an extension of each character's soul and philosophy. Sky's spear is all fluid, sweeping precision. Flying Snow's sword style is a tempest of ungovernable emotion, a blade moved by a broken heart. Broken Sword's technique is elegant and pregnant with intellectual hesitation. Nameless, by contrast, moves with a direct, impossibly fast linearity, the swift, perfect sword of a singular purpose. The battle on the lake in the blue sequence is a masterpiece of elemental combat. The water serves as a second skin, a surface that registers every impact, every skipped heartbeat, every pirouette of a sword. The fighters are not just moving through space, but through a medium of pure reflection, suggesting that this version of the story is a mirror held up to reality, distorted by the ripples of ideology and heroic projection. The fight is less a duel than a shared meditation on duty. The golden-hued attack on the calligraphy school is the film's most overt gesture towards pure, nationalist spectacle. The Qin army, in their black insectoid armor, are a faceless, homogeneous organism of state violence. The deluge of arrows, blotting out the sun in a terrifying golden haze, is a technological and strategic horror the individualist wuxia heroes can never truly defeat. It is the old, romantic, chaotic China of heroes being symbolically overwhelmed by the inevitable, mechanized, unifying future. The film's sound design and its use of silence are as crucial as Tan Dun's score. The whisper of a sleeve, the slash of a blade through a water drop, the deafening roar of an arrow storm. Every sound is amplified and isolated. In the great duels, long moments of complete auditory void are punctuated by the clash of metal, a technique that forces the viewer into a state of hypersensory awareness, mimicking the focused consciousness of the warriors themselves. Tan Dun's score, often using the legendary violinist Itzhak Perlman, is an act of cultural and temporal translation. The music marries the ancient sorrow of Chinese folk melodies with the epic, sweeping emotional registers of a Western orchestra. The main theme is a lament, a recurring musical sigh for all the love, life, and identity that is about to be sacrificed on the altar of the great unity. The score is the sad, wise undersong of history. The political reading of Hero is unavoidable and has made it one of the most debated Chinese films ever made. It can be interpreted as a sophisticated apologia for autocracy, arguing that a single, all-powerful, and brutally decisive ruler is the only solution to chaos. In this light, the film's release was seen by some as an endorsement of the Chinese Communist Party's own narrative of a necessary, if painful, unification and centralization of power under a single, dominant ideology. Zhang Yimou's own defense against charges of propaganda, that art has no political intentions, is itself a deeply political and debatable statement. The film's emotional power does not come from its abstract argument, but from its tragic dramatization of the human cost of this argument. We are made to feel the loss of flying snow and broken swords so keenly that the film seems to simultaneously advocate for and mourn the peace that the king's vision brings. It is not a simple piece of propaganda, but a deeply conflicted, if ultimately deferential, elegy. The deep influence of Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon is structural, but Zhang Yimou elevates the device from a psychological exploration of self-serving truth to a civilizational epic. In Rashomon, the multiple versions are born of human weakness and vanity. In Hero, the versions are competing philosophies of history, presented as grand, aesthetic choices. The question is not what happened, but what is the highest value, love, loyalty, or peace? And what beautiful lie or brutal truth should we build our civilization on? The idea of sword logic versus brush logic is the film's central binary, perfectly incarnated in the broken sword/flying snow relationship. Flying snow believes in the sword's finality. A dead king means a free Zhao. Broken sword has evolved to believe in the brush's permanence. A unified China, born from violence, will allow the brush to flourish in a peace that has no rival kingdoms. The tragedy is that the brush requires the sword to first clear the ground. Broken sword and flying snow represent two sides of China's own romantic soul. The passionate, defiant, loyal, and personal, Xiao Jie, and the universal, philosophical, self-sacrificing, and national De Jie. Their love is doomed because they embody an irreconcilable contradiction at the heart of a period of state formation. You cannot have a love that is purely personal and a peace that is purely universal. The transition from a world of heroes to a world of laws demands the death of both. The scene where Nameless learns that Broken Sword and Flying Snow infiltrated the Qin palace 3 years prior is the thematic keystone. The king's true attackers were in his bedroom, not as assassins but as philosopher judges. Broken Sword's decision to spare him then, a decision made long before Nameless' scheme, reveals that Nameless is not the author of his own sacrifice. He is the final, necessary instrument of a philosophy that Broken Sword had already chosen. The student completes the master's unwritten poem. The concept of the 10-pace kill is a brilliant metaphor for the power of storytelling itself. Nameless lethal technique is called true swordplay in 10 steps, a power so potent that once you are within its range, death is a certainty. This mirrors the position of the storyteller, or the filmmaker, who, by controlling the narrative, can place a thought into the mind of the audience, the king, that is as fatal and irreversible as a sword stroke. Nameless' ultimate weapon is not his sword but his story, which makes the king see the truth of Tianxia. The king's ultimate enlightenment is not a surrender of power, but a tragic deepening of his character. He accepts the mantle of history's butcher. The film's final image of him, sitting alone and immense in his cavernous hall, is a portrait of a man who has lost everything, his enemies, his would-be friends, his human connection, to become the hollow god-emperor his unified world requires. The future Qin Shi Huang is a synthesis of the king and the nameless hero, a man buried alive in his own monument. The Qin arrows that execute Nameless are black, returning the visual field to the dominating, state-sanctioned palette. The arrows are not just weapons. They are the visual signature of the Qin state's impersonal, overwhelming force. They represent a form of death that is not about honor or martial glory, but about the geometric, bureaucratic, unavoidable power of the emerging imperial system. Nameless is absorbed by the black, becoming a silhouette in the national memory. The film's relationship to the historical Qin Shi Huang is deliberately mythopoetic. History records him as a tyrant who burned books and buried scholars, a paranoid seeker of immortality. Hero performs a revolutionary act of historical revisionism, reimagining this archetypal villain as a necessary evil, a sad king who must destroy beauty to build order. The film asks us to momentarily forget the atrocities of the historical record to contemplate a conceptual, what if, about the necessity of a founding monster. The cast functions as a pantheon of Hong Kong and Chinese cinema royalty, each bringing their legendary screen personas to deepen the archetypes they play. Donnie Yen's sky is pure, noble strength. Tony Leung's broken sword is sensitive, world-weary gravitas. Maggie Cheung's flying snow is fierce, tragic beauty. Jet Li's Nameless is stoic, righteous power. This is not mere stunt casting. Their accumulated cinematic histories are part of the text, a visual shorthand for the heroic age that the film is eulogizing. The film's international release, heavily shepherded by Quentin Tarantino in the West, created a fascinating cultural translation. Tarantino understood that the film's operatic, formal qualities and its love for the martial arts genre could appeal to Western audiences' appetite for visual spectacle, even if the specific political and philosophical nuances resonated on a different frequency. The Quentin Tarantino presence, Banner, was a seal of cinematic cool that bridged two very different film cultures. Hero's legacy in the 21st century is that of a great and problematic masterpiece. It successfully globalized the wuxia genre for a new millennium, following the path carved by Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, but with a distinctively grandiose, nationalistic, and aesthetically radical voice. Every subsequent Chinese blockbuster, seeking to marry spectacle with state-friendly ideology, operates in the long shadow of the Qin palace that Zhang Yimou built. The color green appears only briefly, in the flashback to Broken Sword and Flying Snow's youthful failed assassination attempt, and it represents a time of naive, vital hope. The green drapes in their mountain sanctuary evoke a Garden of Eden before the fall, a moment when direct action, simply killing the tyrant, seemed possible. The fading of green from the rest of the film's palette is a visual statement that this kind of innocent, revolutionary belief is no longer possible for these characters. The film's use of calligraphy as a recurring motif is central to its argument about the civilizing process. Calligraphy is the art of channeling violent kinetic energy, the slash of a sword, into a controlled, communicative, and beautiful form. The sword character is the bridge between the martial and the cultured. The film argues that civilization is just the sublimation of violent force into state structure, just as the wild movements of combat are sublimated into the strokes of a brush. The betrayal that Flying Snow feels is fundamentally hermeneutic. Broken Sword has reinterpreted their shared past, their love, and their mission. He has applied a new meaning to their entire life's project, and in doing so, he has erased the woman she was. Her world is destroyed not by a physical act, but by a change in interpretation. Her violent, loving, and suicidal finale is a refusal of this new reading, a stubborn, final insistence on the literal truth of their original vow. The film's treatment of women is complex and bound to the tragic structure. Flying snow and moon are powerful agents, martial equals to the men, but their power is narratively contained within a male philosophical framework that they cannot ultimately alter. They fight beautifully and die for love, while the men fight for, and die for ideas. The film constructs a gendered division of sacrifice, where female passion is a fire that illuminates the stage, but cannot change the state. Nameless walk into the palace. Past the scholars laying out a map of the empire, marks the final transmutation of his mission. The map is the Cartesian grid of the New World Order, a rationalized space that has no room for the vertical, spiritual, mountaintop domain of the wuxia heroes. He is walking from the vertical world of individual transcendence into the horizontal, flat, mapped world of imperial administration. His death ratifies the map. The visual motif of flying, in hair, fabric, and bodies, is the persistent cinematic signifier of the wuxia genre's pre-modern freedom. Characters constantly float, liberated from gravity, existing in a spiritual realm of pure will. The Qin Palace, by contrast, is a monument to gravity, heaviness, and stone. The suppression of flying is the project of the state, which seeks to ground all transcendent individualism into the terrestrial duty of the subject. The nameless character's name is his philosophical argument. He is not an individual but a function, a citizen who is a hero. His anonymity allows him to represent the countless unknown dead of the warring states period. He is everyman, and his choice is the choice the film posits for all who desire peace. To accept a nameless role in a great, impersonal historical project, with your identity absorbed into the collective national name. The last shot of the Great Wall is perhaps the only moment of pure, uncomplicated nationalist closure. The wall, a structure as much a monument to suffering as to unity, is presented in a glorious, sweeping crane shot, a line drawn across the mountains. The film ties its fictional myth of nameless sacrifice directly to the physical architecture of China, suggesting that the nation itself is a text written in blood and stone, a calligraphy of statecraft on the landscape. The dialectical structure of the film, thesis, red, antithesis, blue, and synthesis, white, maps onto a Hegelian view of history. Truth is not found in a single static story, but in the violent, beautiful collision of opposites. The all-under-heaven philosophy is a synthesis that transcends the personal passions of the red thesis and the strategic self-sacrifice of the blue antithesis, arriving at a bitter, mature truth that incorporates both but subordinates them to a higher goal. The final effect of Hero is a profound and lingering sadness. The music, the images of the lovers dead in the desert, the man pierced by arrows in the void, all point to an emotional truth that runs counter to its political argument. The film's head makes a case for utilitarian autocracy, but its heart composes an unforgettable elegy for all the human beauty, the passionate, individual, artistic, and romantic beauty that is annihilated to make way for that future. It is a hymn to what is lost in the making of a nation. The cinema of Hero is a cinema of sublimation. The film takes the basest political directive, justify authoritarian unity, and sublimates it into the highest aesthetic and philosophical realms. This is its magic and its danger. It makes the spectator fall in love with a logic they may intellectually despise, because that logic is wrapped in a vision of such staggering beauty. It demonstrates that the ultimate power of cinema is not to argue a point, but to make an idea feel like a magnificent, heartbreaking, and inescapable truth. The film's title, Hero, is its first and most profound act of misdirection, a single word that the entire narrative works to deconstruct, complicate, and ultimately redefine beyond the simplistic binary of killer and savior. Nameless is introduced as a man who has supposedly achieved the ultimate heroic act of eliminating threats to the crown. Yet his heroism is entirely predicated on a performance of loyalty that the audience immediately suspects is a mask for a deeper, more dangerous truth hidden within the 10 paces he has been granted. The King of Qin, played with a coiled, simmering intelligence by Chen Daoming, is initially framed as the archetypal tyrant whose paranoia is a rational response to a world where every shadow might conceal a blade. Yet the film will gradually reveal him as the only character capable of understanding the philosophical weight of his enemies' sacrifices. The physicality of the 100-pace decree is a spatial manifestation of the gulf between the individual and the state, a distance that Nameless must symbolically and literally traverse through the power of storytelling, each recounted tale reducing the gap until he stands within the fatal radius of his perfect technique. The 3 iron boxes presented to the king are not merely containers for weapons, but are sarcophagi of identity, each one supposedly holding the extinguished soul of a legendary warrior whose name alone once had the power to tremble the foundations of the Qin throne room. The architecture of the Qin palace is a character in itself, a labyrinth of soaring obsidian pillars and vertiginous empty spaces that dwarf the human figure, transforming the court into a metaphysical arena where the battle is not for territory, but for the soul of a civilization about to be born from an ocean of blood. The film's opening sequence operates as a ritual of state power, the measured, echoing footsteps of Nameless and the chanted decrees of the court officials creating an auditory landscape of absolute control that the subsequent explosion of color-drenched flashbacks will violently disrupt. The first narrative, saturated in a red so intense it feels like a fever dream, is not simply a lie but a projection of how the state imagines the hearts of its enemies. Chaotic, driven by lust and jealousy, and ultimately self-destructive in their petty passions. The calligraphy school in the Red Story represents the last bastion of Zhao's cultural sovereignty, a place where the act of writing becomes an act of defiance, each stroke of the brush a small, dignified rebellion against the encroaching tide of Qin's militaristic order. The character of the old calligrapher, who continues to practice his art even as the arrows darken the sky, is a romanticized martyr of humanistic tradition. His stubborn insistence on completing the character for Sword, a testament to a world where culture and combat are still inextricably linked. The rain of black arrows that descends upon the school is a visual metaphor of terrifying efficiency, each shaft a single, identical death sentence delivered from a faceless distance, representing a form of warfare that has no interest in the individual heroics of the warriors it annihilates. The introduction of Moon, Broken Sword's servant and a master of twin blades, adds a layer of operatic tragedy to the Red narrative, her silent devotion and explosive grief painting a portrait of a love that exists only in the shadows of a greater, more consuming passion between sword and snow. The duel between flying snow and moon in the swirling vortex of golden-red leaves is choreographed as a dance of displaced rage, 2 women destroying each other over a man whose heart is already lost to an idea that neither of them can fully comprehend or combat. The leaves themselves function as a visual chorus, their frantic, swirling motion externalizing the inner turmoil of the characters, each fallen leaf a tear shed by the dying autumn of the Zhao kingdom, a beautiful, melancholic confetti of a world in its terminal decline. When the king abruptly dismisses Nameless' tale as a fabrication, the film performs its first radical narrative break, shattering the illusion of a stable narrator and revealing that the true contest is between 2 minds acutely aware that they are engaged in a duel of fictions. The king's counter-narrative, awash in a serene, intellectual blue, is not a search for truth, but an assertion of his own interpretive supremacy, a demonstration that his power lies not only in his armies, but in his capacity to read the souls of his enemies more accurately than they can read themselves. The blue color palette drains the world of visceral heat, replacing the fiery passion of the Red chapter with a cool, almost melancholy grandeur that transforms assassination from an act of hatred into a solemn, self-sacrificial ritual for the greater good. The laketop battle between Nameless and Long Sky in this version is a dialogue of equals conducted through the medium of sword and spear, the liquid surface beneath their feet acting as a mirror that reflects their mutual recognition of a shared, sorrowful destiny. The moment Sky's spear traces an impossible arc through a suspended water droplet is a crystallization of the film's aesthetic philosophy, that within the fluid, ever-shifting medium of memory and narrative, a single, perfect gesture of grace can be frozen for eternity. The sword calligraphy scroll in the blue narrative is recontextualized as a secret correspondence between Broken Sword and the king, a philosophical treaty written in a language that transcends the spoken word, communicating a vision of statecraft that only 2 men of supreme martial and intellectual attainment could decipher. The blue version's tragic climax, where Broken Sword mortally wounds flying snow in a moonlit mountain pool, is an act that the king interprets as a necessary, heroic sacrifice, a surgical removal of passionate, individual love to preserve the collective, strategic objective of the assassination plot. Nameless' confession that the king is correct in substance but mistaken in spirit initiates the film's movement into the white, truthful register, a liminal space where the psychological projections of red and blue are stripped away to reveal the raw, unadorned bedrock of historical and personal reality. The 3-year flashback to the previous assassination attempt is the film's great moral fulcrum. The moment when broken sword and flying snow, depicted in the fleeting, verdant green of youthful certainty, stand within a blade's breadth of the king and discover the abyss that separates the act of killing from the act of making history. The green drapes and lush fabrics of their mountain sanctuary evoke a lost Eden, a prelapsarian state where the political calculus of unified peace had not yet intruded upon the simple, romantic logic of killing a tyrant to free one's homeland from his iron grasp. Broken Sword's paralysis in the throne room is not cowardice, but a catastrophic, instantaneous enlightenment. A vision of the future that reveals the king's death would not liberate his people, but would instead condemn the entire Central Plain to another century of internecine slaughter among warring states. His decision to lower his sword is a betrayal of such profound magnitude that it shatters the very foundation of his identity, transforming him from a warrior of Zhao into a stateless philosopher, whose love is now a prisoner of a truth his lover can never accept. The calligraphy he writes in the sand, all under heaven, is the film's thesis statement made visible. Two characters drawn in the impermanent medium of desert dust that nonetheless possess the conceptual weight to reorder the moral universe of anyone who truly comprehends their meaning. The king's tears upon hearing this revelation are the tears of a monster who has found his justification. A lonely god of war who suddenly discovers that his most hated enemy has provided the moral and philosophical absolution that his own ideology could never supply. Nameless internal transformation in the desert is the quiet center of the film, a spiritual death and rebirth where the orphan child of Zhao vengeance is buried and a new man, a citizen of a yet unborn China, emerges with a terrible, enlightened purpose. His perfect 10-pace strike technique, which guarantees death without the victim's immediate awareness, becomes a metaphor for the delayed but inevitable impact of philosophical truth, a sword stroke of the mind that kills the old self long before the body recognizes its own passing. When Nameless stands within 10 paces of the king and chooses the empty scabbard over the drawn sword, he performs a double sacrifice. He abandons his personal revenge, and simultaneously forces the king to witness a moral act that legitimizes the tyrant's own brutal path more effectively than any military victory ever could. The king's subsequent order to execute Nameless is the film's most ruthless dialectical turn. The moment when the philosophy of all under heaven is institutionalized as state law, demanding the death of the very hero who affirmed it to prove that no individual, however noble, stands above the impersonal machinery of imperial order. The volley of black arrows that pierces the palace gate, leaving a man-shaped void of light where Nameless once stood, is a visual apotheosis that transforms a political assassination into a founding sacrifice, a martyrdom whose image will be seared into the architecture of the new dynasty. The film frames this execution not as a tragedy, but as a ceremonial consecration, the state absorbing the hero's body into its own symbolic fabric, granting him a warrior's burial that will serve as a mythic cornerstone for the unification he chose to enable. Flying Snow's journey through the white desert in the aftermath of Nameless' decision is a pilgrimage of desolation. A woman whose entire cosmos of meaning, love, homeland, vengeance, has been annihilated not by an enemy's sword, but by a philosophy that has poisoned the man she loves. Her confrontation with Broken Sword is an inquisition of the heart, a demand that he account for the theft of her future, her past, and her very understanding of who they were when they first pledged their blades and their lives to the cause of Zhao. Broken Sword's refusal to draw his blade in this final duel is the ultimate expression of his philosophical commitment, a renunciation of violence that paradoxically manifests as the most profound act of love he can offer, allowing her to kill the man who betrayed her dreams. His death, impaled on her sword in the vast white emptiness, is a suicide by ideological proxy, a final surrender that seeks to atone for the sin of placing the abstract good of a future nation above the concrete, breathing reality of the woman who stood beside him. Flying Snow's subsequent suicide is not a defeat, but a reunion, a defiant assertion that in a universe of shifting narratives and political necessities, the absolute, uncompromising fact of their love is the one truth she will carry beyond the grave. Her body collapsing onto his, white robes staining into the white sand, forms a pieta of personal tragedy that exists in eternal, silent opposition to the official, state-sponsored martyrdom of Nameless, two competing forms of sacrifice that the film refuses to hierarchize. The cinematography in these final desert scenes achieves a kind of sublime minimalism, the horizon line dividing an empty sky from an empty earth, reducing the cosmic drama of love and empire to three figures whose choices will be inscribed into the mythology of a civilization. Christopher Doyle's camera does not merely record these landscapes but inhabits them, moving with a liquid, weightless grace that mirrors the wuxia tradition's defiance of gravity, transforming the Gobi Desert into a vast, monochromatic stage for a moral opera. The color white in this sequence accumulates layers of meaning. It is the truth laid bare, the mourning shroud of a dying heroic age, the blank page upon which history will be written, and the blinding light of an absolute that obliterates all subjective, passionate shades of red and blue. The elemental choreography of the film extends beyond the fights into the very relationship between bodies and the spaces they occupy, with the warriors in the white desert appearing to float above the sand, already half-spectral, already becoming the legends they will leave behind. Tan Dun's score, with Itzhak Perlman's violin sobbing through the silence, functions as the emotional unconscious of the film, a voice that articulates the grief, longing, and terrible beauty that the characters' stoic faces and philosophical declarations deliberately suppress. The recurring musical motif is a lament for a world of individual heroism that is passing away, a requiem for the flying snows and broken swords whose grand, passionate, and destructive love stories have no place in the rationalized, bureaucratic empire rising from the ashes of the warring states. The film's ultimate political ambiguity is its greatest artistic strength, refusing to resolve the tension between the utilitarian case for autocratic peace and the tragic, irreducible value of the human loves and loyalties that are immolated in its name. The final shot, a breathtaking aerial view of the Great Wall snaking across the mountains, is an image of sublime contradiction, a monument to both the defensive genius and the murderous forced labor of the unified empire, a scar on the landscape that is also a symbol of an enduring civilization. The wall is the material fossil of the philosophy, all under heaven, a structure that required the deaths of countless nameless heroes to build, and its image at the film's close asks the audience to sit with the uncomfortable, awe-inspiring reality of what their sacrifice purchased. The film's narrative structure is a labyrinth that leads not to a single exit, but to a clearing where multiple, contradictory truths coexist. The Rashomon device evolving from a psychological trick into a profound meditation on how history is constructed from the competing fictions we tell about our collective past. The cast's performances are calibrated to the specific color and mood of each narrative segment, their acting styles shifting from the operatic excess of the red chapter to the stoic nobility of the blue to the serene, transcendent weariness of the white truth. Jet Li's Nameless is a performance of progressive internal evacuation, the martial artist gradually emptying his face of the passionate hatred that once defined him until all that remains is the serene, sorrowful mask of a man who has accepted his own historical erasure. Tony Leung's eyes carry the entire philosophical weight of the film, his gaze communicating the exhaustion of a man who has seen the face of the future and must now live with the knowledge that he betrayed everyone he loved to bring it into being. Maggie Cheung's Flying Snow is a portrait of rage as a form of fidelity, her unwavering commitment to the personal, the immediate, and the emotional serving as a permanent, silent indictment of the men who sacrificed the real for the abstract. The film's legacy in global cinema is that of a gateway drug to the philosophical and aesthetic possibilities of the wuxia genre, proving that films of martial combat could simultaneously function as lyrical poems, political treatises, and moral conundrums of the highest order. Hero is, in its final synthesis, an act of cinematic calligraphy, each frame a brushstroke that channels the violent chaos of a war-torn era into the controlled, beautiful, and permanent form of a masterpiece that asks the viewer not for a verdict, but for an act of sustained, uncomfortable contemplation. The film does not answer the question of whether the King of Qin was a savior or a monster, nor does it resolve whether nameless sacrifice was a noble act of transcendence or a tragic capitulation. Instead, it holds these paradoxes in a suspended, shimmering equilibrium, trusting the audience to live within the unbearable tension of a choice that has no clean resolution. The pre-credit sequence of Hero is a masterclass in establishing dread through stillness, the monumental bronze vessels, and the petrified courtiers creating a necropolis-like atmosphere where life has been replaced by the ceremony of absolute power. The anonymous, identical courtiers who populate the Qin Palace are not individuals, but components of a living architecture, their synchronized movements and uniform black robes transforming the human form into a repeating motif of state geometry. The sound of nameless footsteps on the polished stone floor is amplified to an almost unbearable degree, each footfall a metronomic countdown to the moment when the distance between the prefect and the king will collapse into a singularity of irreversible decision. The king's decree that he will reward Nameless with gold, land, and a promotion is a test disguised as a generosity, a probing of the prefect's soul to determine whether his motivations are mercenary, ambitious, or something far more treacherous. The three weapons Nameless presents, a spear, a sword, and a broken blade, are relics of a dismantled pantheon, the holy instruments of a trinity of warrior deities now reduced to mute evidence in a bureaucratic procedure of imperial validation. The long corridor that Nameless traverses to approach the king is a tunnel through time itself, the diminishing perspective lines drawing the eye towards a vanishing point that represents both the king's throne and the historical horizon of a unified China. The film's first visual explosion into the red narrative is a shock of sensory liberation after the monochromatic oppression of the Qin court, the crimson draperies and the saturated light flooding the screen with a sensuality that the state's gray world has entirely banished. The gambling house where Nameless first confronts Long Sky is a microcosm of the warring states in miniature, a chaotic space of chance, skill, and sudden violence where fortunes and lives are wagered on the turn of a dice or the speed of a blade. The blind musician who continues to play his instrument through the battle between Nameless and Sky is a figure of cosmic indifference, an artistic witness whose melody persists beyond the concerns of warriors and kings, suggesting a beauty that outlasts all mortal conflict. The raindrops that hang suspended in the air during their duel are tears shed by the heavens for a world locked in perpetual slaughter. Each crystalline sphere a frozen moment of grief that Nameless' sword will shatter in his inexorable progress towards the king. The sound design in this sequence isolates the plink of each water droplet with crystalline clarity, creating an auditory space where the distinction between a raindrop falling and a sword striking becomes philosophically irrelevant. The old man at the calligraphy school, who declares he will not flee the Qin arrows, is the film's portrait of cultural stubbornness elevated to the level of existential defiance, a refusal to concede that the written word is powerless against the launched projectile. The students who remain with him, their red robes marking them as disciples of a dying tradition, are the last congregation of a faith in the civilizing power of art, their bodies forming a protective circle around a master whose only weapon is a wolf hair brush. The character force sword that the old man inscribes is the film's central symbol made literal, an ideogram that contains within its brushstrokes the entire argument about whether the blade's highest purpose is to take life or to give meaning. The Qin army's volley of arrows that darkens the sky is a technological eclipse, a man-made night that blots out the sun of the old chivalric order and announces the dawn of an age where mass-produced death replaces individual martial glory. The arrows that pierce the bodies of the students and the calligrapher do not discriminate between the learned and the ignorant, the artist and the peasant. They are the great equalizer of state violence, the democratic distribution of imperial annihilation. The red narrative's portrayal of Flying Snow and Broken Sword's relationship as a tangle of erotic jealousy and murderous pride is a defamation that the king will later expose. Yet it reveals more about the Qin court's own anxieties regarding the ungovernable nature of passion. Moon, the devoted servant, is the film's most tragic minor figure, a woman whose entire existence is defined by a love she can never fully possess and a loyalty that will be repaid only with a beautiful, meaningless death in a storm of autumn leaves. Her twin blades, wielded in a dance of desperate fury against Flying Snow, are extensions of a fractured psyche, two weapons that mirror each other as her heart mirrors the broken halves of a love triangle she can neither escape nor resolve. The red fabric that swirls around the dueling women is a metaphor for the inescapable entanglements of desire, a textile web that binds them together even as their swords seek to sever the bonds of rivalry and pain. The king's laughter upon hearing Nameless' red tale is an eruption of intellectual contempt, a monarch's amusement at the notion that his intelligence apparatus could be so insulted by a narrative that reduces legendary warriors to the protagonists of a common bedroom farce. His ability to deduce the true depth of the assassin's character from his own intimate knowledge of their previous attempts reveals a strange, almost romantic bond between the tyrant and his would-be killers, a mutual understanding that transcends the enmity of their political positions. The king's theory that Sky and Snow willingly sacrifice their lives is a projection of his own desire for a world where enemies can recognize the necessity of his project, a wish-fulfillment fantasy of voluntary martyrdom for the cause of unification. The blue narrative's lake is a placid, meditative surface that reflects the sky, suggesting that this version of events aspires to a celestial, idealized truth, a story that has transcended the muddy, bloody earth of the red chapter and entered the realm of pure philosophical abstraction. The fight between Nameless and Sky on this lake is not a battle but a ballet of mutual consent. Every parry and thrust a pre-agreed step in a choreography of sacrifice that will culminate in Sky's beautiful, deliberate fall. Sky's spear, broken in the duel, is a symbol of the fragmentation that the warriors are willingly embracing, the shattering of their individual identities into the mosaic of a grander, collective design. The calligraphy scroll in the blue version is no longer a simple artwork, but a diplomatic pouch containing the secret correspondence between two great minds, the brushstrokes encoding a message that only the king, with his transcendent perception, can properly decipher. The king's assertion that Broken Sword has reached the 20th level of swordsmanship, where the sword itself becomes irrelevant, is a moment of profound artistic and philosophical recognition, a salute from one supreme master of his domain to another. The blue-tinted love scene between Broken Sword and Flying Snow is a memory of tenderness that the king's narrative must include to make the subsequent sacrifice plausible, a brief glimpse of what is being offered up before the blade descends. Flying Snow's wound in the blue story is a stigmata of ideological commitment, her blood mingling with the mountain's spring water to form a dilute, tragic ink that writes her name into the annals of the failed but glorious assassination plot. The king's reconstruction of events is revealed to be as much a fiction as Nameless, a humbling reminder that even the most perceptive intelligence cannot fully grasp the irrational, emotional core of another human being's heart. The transition to the white narrative is a geographical and spiritual migration, the characters retreating from the enclosed spaces of courts and calligraphy schools into the vast, open desert where the only witnesses to their choices are the sand, the wind, and the infinite sky. The desert is the ante-palace, a space of absolute exposure where the protective walls of state, clan, and rank dissolve, leaving the characters naked before the elemental questions of existence and purpose. Broken Sword's calligraphy in the sand is an act of writing that accepts its own impermanence, a philosophical treatise traced in a medium that the next wind will erase, embodying the Buddhist recognition that all forms, including nations and philosophies, are transient. The characters he writes are not mere words but living presences, the strokes of his brush pulling the vast, empty landscape into a momentary, meaningful configuration before the desert reclaims its primordial blankness. Nameless education in the White Desert is a conversion experience structured like a religious awakening, the scales of patriotic vengeance falling from his eyes as he contemplates the two characters that redefine his entire moral universe. The king's realization that he has been understood by his greatest enemy is a moment of profound existential relief, the dismantling of a loneliness so absolute that it has become indistinguishable from the architecture of his throne room. His tears are the first genuine, uncalculated emotion the film has permitted in the Qin Palace, a crack in the obsidian facade of absolute rule through which a sliver of vulnerable, frightened, grateful humanity briefly flickers. Nameless' decision to spare the king is often misinterpreted as a submission to authority, yet the film frames it as the ultimate assertion of agency, a choice so radical that it overrides every natural impulse of grief, rage, and patriotic duty. His empty scabbard, held aloft as he turns his back on the king, is a vessel of pure potential, a container for the sword that will never be drawn, the murder that will never be committed, the future that will be allowed to unfold. The king's order to execute Nameless is delivered with a visible tremor of anguish, the first crack in his imperial composure revealing that he has internalized Broken Sword's philosophy and now understands the full, terrible cost of the peace he is building. The wall of black arrows that erases Nameless' silhouette from the palace gate is a signature of the Qin aesthetic, the same impersonal, mass-produced violence that annihilated the calligraphy school, now sanctifying the body of the man who transcended its logic. The hero's funeral that follows is a state co-option of individual sacrifice, the machinery of imperial propaganda already at work transforming a complex, agonized philosophical choice into a simplified, patriotic myth for public consumption. Flying Snow's journey across the White Desert after Nameless' departure is a via dolorosa of abandoned love, her figure a dark, diminishing speck in an immensity of white that represents the erasure of all she held sacred. Her accusation that Broken Sword has poisoned Nameless' mind with his philosophy is a cry of epistemological despair, a lament that the man she loved has become a carrier of a mental contagion that dissolves the certainties of blood and homeland. Broken Sword's death by Flying Snow's blade is a form of suicide that preserves her agency while absolving her of murder, a final, intricate act of love from a philosopher who arranges his own exit in a way that leaves her the choice of how to proceed. His body, lying in the white sand with her sword still quivering in his chest, is an offering on the altar of their shared past, a sacrifice to the god of a love that existed before philosophy, before the nation, before the idea of all under heaven poisoned everything. Flying Snow's final scream, echoing across the empty desert as she drives her own sword into her heart, is the film's only moment of unmediated prelinguistic grief, a sound that no narrative frame can contain, reinterpret, or aestheticize. The two bodies entwined in the white void form a counter-monument to the official memorial of Nameless, a private, tragic sculpture that the state will never claim, never consecrate, and never fully understand. The return to the black palette for the film's coda reasserts the dominance of the Qin aesthetic, the brief, beautiful explosion of color that constituted the bulk of the narrative now sealed back into the obsidian vault of official history. The king, alone in his immense throne room after the execution, is a figure of absolute cosmic solitude, a man who has won the world and lost every soul that might have shared it with him, his victory indistinguishable from an eternal, self-imposed exile. The final image of the Great Wall, viewed from an impossible, godlike altitude, is a closing statement of terrifying ambiguity. A structure that is simultaneously a wonder of human achievement and a graveyard of the conscripted. A scar that is also a signature. The wall endures, and in its endurance it asks the question that the entire film has been circling. Whether the piece purchased by such monstrous means is a bargain with history or an unforgivable crime dressed in the beautiful rhetoric of necessity. Hero ultimately functions as a mirror held up to its audience, reflecting back whatever philosophy of history, love, and sacrifice the viewer brings to it, a masterpiece of structured ambiguity that refuses to resolve its central paradox into the comfort of a clear moral verdict. The opening frames of Hero establish a chromatic dictatorship, a world where the very concept of color has been banished to the margins of memory, leaving only the stark, funereal opposition of black stone and pale flesh under the cold light of an invisible sun. The palace guards, arrayed in their thousands like a terracotta army prematurely entombed, are not merely soldiers but architectural elements, their spears forming a forest of vertical lines that recede into an infinite, misty perspective of absolute geometric authority. The king's throne is less a seat than a conceptual point, the still center of a turning universe of violence that has spun for centuries, waiting for a hand steady and ruthless enough to arrest its chaotic motion and impose a single, immutable axis. Nameless enters this space as a living contradiction, a man whose very name announces his insignificance, yet whose claim to have killed 3 legends demands a radical reevaluation of the hierarchy that separates the anonymous from the immortal. The narrative device of the 100 Paces is a temporal as well as a spatial measure. Each step Nameless is permitted to advance representing a decade of the Warring States period. The distance between him and the king collapsing 3 centuries of chaos into a single, climactic conversation. The 3 boxes are presented in a ritual sequence that mimics a religious offering, the weapons within them transformed into relics of a defeated faith, the cult of individual heroism that the Qin state is determined to supplant with the worship of institutional power. The king's decision to allow Nameless to speak is the first crack in the edifice of absolute power, an admission that even the most fortified tyranny requires the validation of narrative, the consent of the governed as expressed through the stories they tell about their rulers. The red chapter erupts onto the screen like a wound opening, its saturated crimsons and vermilions a visual hemorrhage that stains the austere canvas of the film with the messy, uncontrollable vitality of a world that refuses to be pacified. The gambling house sequence is a study in controlled chaos, the swirling dancers and the rolling dice creating a kinetic tapestry of chance and fate that Nameless, with his preternatural stillness, will penetrate like a surgical instrument of destiny. Long Sky's spear is an extension of his personality, a weapon of fluid, sweeping grandeur that paints calligraphic arcs in the rain-soaked air, each movement a brushstroke in a martial art that aspires to the condition of poetry. The raindrops that pause in midair during their duel are the film's first overt gesture towards the supernatural, a suspension of natural law that signals the audience is entering a realm where the physical is subordinate to the philosophical. The old calligrapher's assertion that the soul of Zhao resides in its written characters is a defiantly humanist claim, a belief that the identity of a people can survive the annihilation of its armies and the razing of its cities as long as the brush continues to move across the page. His students, arrayed around him in a protective circle, are a living mandala of cultural transmission, their bodies forming a barrier as fragile as paper against the iron rain of the Qin arrows, a sacrifice that the film frames as both noble and utterly futile. The character for sword that he completes in his dying moments is a testament to the idea that art is a form of resistance that outlasts the artist, a single, perfect ideogram that will survive the fire and the slaughter to testify that Zhao once existed. The Red Chapter's portrayal of the love triangle between sword, snow, and moon is a melodrama of operatic intensity, a narrative strategy that the king will later expose as a crude psychological projection, yet one that exerts a primal, visceral power. Moon's unrequited love for Broken Sword is the silent engine of her tragedy, a devotion so absolute that it has consumed her identity, leaving only a function: the servant, the avenger, the sacrificial lamb, where a person once might have been. Her duel with flying snow amidst the swirling leaves is a ballet of mutual annihilation. Two women destroying each other over a man who has already transcended the erotic, his heart now belonging to an abstraction that neither of them can wound with a blade. The golden leaves that surround them are the shed skin of a dying season, an autumnal elegy for a world of passionate attachments that the coming winter of imperial order will freeze into the statuesque, bloodless serenity of state-sanctioned art. The king's interruption of Nameless' tale is a narrative coup d'état, a seizure of the storytelling apparatus that reveals the throne as not merely a seat of military power, but an editing suite where the raw footage of history is cut, rearranged, and given its definitive meaning. His insight that the assassins are figures of transcendent skill and honor is not born of empathy, but of a tyrant's paranoid omniscience, the knowledge that his enemies must be worthy of him if his victory is to possess any grandeur. The Blue Chapter is a vision of heroism as a shared, suicidal compact, a conspiracy of the virtuous who recognize that their individual deaths are the necessary pigment for the painting of a unified realm they will never inhabit. The lake where Nameless and Sky conduct their revised duel is a liquid stage, its surface a membrane between the world of appearances and the world of truth, the warriors descending through it as if diving into the subconscious of the narrative itself. Their fight, with its slow-motion arabesques and its mutual, almost tender precision, is a death-pact choreographed as a wedding dance, two souls binding themselves together in a sacrifice that will sanctify the mission they serve. Sky's spear, sweeping across the water's surface in a final, exquisite gesture, leaves a trail of concentric ripples that are the visual echo of a life departing, the disturbance on the surface gradually calming into the stillness of legend. The scroll in the blue narrative becomes a sacred text, the character for sword now pregnant with an esoteric meaning that only the initiate, the king, Broken Sword, and now Nameless, can decode, a secret handshake across the battle lines of a philosophical war. The king's recognition that the sword can transcend its function as a killing instrument is a moment of unexpected poetry, a brutal conqueror revealing a connoisseur's appreciation for the subtle gradations of martial aesthetics. The Blue Chapter's portrayal of Flying Snow's death at Broken Sword's hands is a sacrifice within a sacrifice, a nesting doll of martyrdom where the woman's life is offered up to enable the man's mission, a calculus of value that the White Chapter will ultimately reject. The king's confession that his version is also incomplete is a moment of epistemological humility that transforms him from a mere tyrant into a tragic philosopher king, aware that even his penetrating gaze cannot see around the final corner of the human heart. The transition to the White Chapter is a pilgrimage from the lush, colored interiors of memory to the bleached, arid plateau of truth, a landscape so stripped of comfort that the characters' very presences seem like an intrusion on a canvas of pure, metaphysical abstraction. The green flashback within the white narrative is the film's lost paradise, a brief, verdant glimpse of the life Broken Sword and Flying Snow shared before the serpent of philosophy entered their garden and whispered the seductive, poisonous idea of all under heaven. Their infiltration of the Qin palace, depicted in this verdant flashback, is a masterpiece of silent, ghostly violence, their blades carving a path through the faceless guards with an ease that renders the entire apparatus of state security a laughable, paper-thin illusion. Broken Sword's epiphany in the throne room is a moment of terrifying clarity, a vision of the future that reveals the king's death as the key that would unlock a Pandora's box of infinite, self-perpetuating warfare, a chaos far worse than the tyranny it would avenge. His decision to spare the king is a treason that makes him an exile from his own identity, a man of Zhao who has betrayed his homeland for a concept that does not yet exist, a citizen of a unified China that is still only a ghostly possibility. The characters he traces in the sand are not merely words but a spell, an incantation that summons into being the philosophical framework that will justify the deaths of everyone he loves, including himself, on the altar of a peace they will never see. Nameless absorption of this philosophy is a conversion that the film presents not as brainwashing, but as a painful, reluctant awakening, the slow, agonizing dawn of a consciousness that recognizes the insufficiency of personal vengeance against the backdrop of historical necessity. His return to the Qin Palace is a descent from the white mountain of revelation into the black valley of political consequence. His body now a vessel for an idea that will detonate within the throne room with more force than any physical blade could deliver. The 10 paces that separate him from the king are now charged with a different kind of tension. The question no longer being whether he can kill the tyrant, but whether he can transcend the entire logic of killing, whether the sword can be voluntarily sheathed in the name of a higher order. His empty scabbard, pointed at the king's heart, is the ultimate martial arts technique, a strike that kills without drawing blood, an assassination of the old world performed with a weapon that is the absence of a weapon. The king's tearful acceptance of Broken Sword's philosophy is a baptism of the tyrant, a washing away of the old, merely brutal Qin king and the birth of the future Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor whose legitimacy will be rooted in the voluntary sacrifice of his enemies. His order to execute Nameless is the final, terrible proof of his conversion, the demonstration that he now understands the logic of all under heaven as a law that binds even the lawgiver, a principle that cannot make exceptions for personal gratitude or moral debt. The wall of arrows that obliterates Nameless' silhouette is a negative image of the calligraphy school massacre, the same impersonal, state violence now applied to a victim who has consented to its logic, a sacrifice that sanctifies rather than merely annihilates. The hero's funeral that follows is a ceremony of absorption, the state taking the individual's sacrifice and weaving it into its own foundational mythology, a story that will be told for millennia to justify the necessary cruelties of unification. Flying Snow's final journey across the white desert is a procession of inconsolable grief, her figure a dark, moving wound in the landscape, a woman whose entire world has been dismantled not by an enemy's cruelty, but by a lover's philosophical treason. Her confrontation with Broken Sword is an inquisition that demands an answer to a question philosophy cannot address. How do you justify the breaking of a heart, the betrayal of a vow, the erasure of a shared past in the name of a future that feels like an abstraction? Broken Sword's suicide by lover is his final philosophical act, a concession that the abstract cannot console the concrete, that the idea of all under heaven cannot kiss away the tears of the woman who has lost everything, and that the only remaining gift is the gift of his own life, freely offered. Flying Snow's suicide, her body collapsing onto his in the vast, silent desert, is a reassertion of the personal over the political, a stubborn, final declaration that love is not a means to an end, that the individual heart is not a sacrifice to be offered on the altar of the collective, and that their story, though unwritten in the official chronicles, is as true as any empire. The final image of the Great Wall is a signature written across the face of the continent, a line that divides and unites, a monument to both the visionary genius and the monstrous cruelty of the unified state, an ambiguous testament that Hero leaves for the audience to contemplate in the long, echoing silence after the screen fades to black. The very first frame of Hero is a declaration of aesthetic war against the naturalistic expectations of the historical epic, an image of such stark, monumental abstraction that it immediately transports the viewer into a mythic space where physical laws are subordinate to the geometry of power. The black of the Qin Palace is not merely a color, but a philosophical void, an absorption of all light that represents the state's appetite for consuming every competing source of illumination, every flickering candle of regional identity and individual ambition. The thousands of courtiers standing in frozen attendance are a human forest petrified by the Medusa gaze of absolute sovereignty, their individuality so thoroughly erased that they have become a single, breathing organism of deference and dread. The soundscape of this opening is a composition of negative space, the echoing footfalls and the whispered decrees creating an auditory architecture of intimidation that is as solid and oppressive as the obsidian walls that confine the characters. The king's voice, when he finally speaks, is an instrument of measured imperial calm, a vocal mask that conceals the hypervigilant predator beneath. A man who has survived countless assassination attempts by learning to hear the knife hidden within the syllable. The 100 paces that separate the throne from the supplicant are a diagram of the distance between power and its subjects, a carefully calibrated interval that has been refined over centuries of regicide to be precisely one step beyond the reach of any known weapon. Nameless' claim to have killed the 3 assassins is a narrative atom bomb, a statement that instantly vaporizes the psychological equilibrium of the court and creates a vacuum of credibility that the ensuing stories will rush to fill. The 3 weapons he lays before the king are not merely proof of his victories, but a challenge to the very concept of proof. Objects that demand a story to animate them. Inert metal that requires the galvanizing electricity of narrative to become evidence. The king's decision to grant Nameless the unprecedented privilege of approaching to within 10 paces is a wager of extraordinary hubris. A tyrant's gamble that his ability to decode a story is a more reliable defense than 100 paces of empty space. The narrative structure that unfolds from this wager is a matryoshka doll of authorship, each version of events nested within the previous one, each storyteller attempting to impose a definitive shape on a reality that proves to be infinitely malleable. The color red, when it floods the screen for Nameless' first tale, is not a pigment but an emotion made visible, the distilled essence of rage, lust, and patriotic fervor that courses through the veins of a kingdom bleeding to death. The gambling house is a space of moral and physical vertigo, its swirling silks and tumbling dice a cacophony of chance that Nameless, the agent of fate, will penetrate with the cold, straight line of his unerring purpose. Long Sky, as he appears in this first incarnation, is a figure of almost barbaric grandeur, a warrior whose spear is a lightning bolt made wood and steel, a weapon of such ferocious beauty that its wielder seems less a man than a force of nature temporarily confined in human form. The raindrops that become the visual leitmotif of their duel are the tears of the old world, each one a crystalline sphere of grief for a way of life that is about to be extinguished by the relentless, logical advance of the Qin war machine. The fight choreography in this sequence is a dialogue of weapons, the spear and the sword exchanging philosophies of combat in a language of parry and thrust, a conversation that will culminate in the final, decisive argument of Nameless' blade. The old calligrapher in the red tail is a fossil of a dying civilization, his brush an instrument of resistance that continues to write the name of Zhao long after the military power of the state has been shattered and scattered to the winds. His students, the young men in red who surround him as the arrows darken the sky, are the last congregation of a faith in the written word, a belief that the character for sword is a talisman that can protect the soul of a nation even as its body is pierced by 1,000 shafts. The Qin arrows that descend upon the school are the arguments of the future, each one a syllogism of iron and wood that refutes the romantic humanism of the calligrapher with brutal, irrefutable finality. The red narrative's depiction of the love triangle is a grotesque caricature of the human heart, a reduction of the complex, tragic bond between sword and snow to a sordid melodrama of infidelity and revenge, a simplification that the king's keener intelligence will immediately detect and dismantle. Moon, in this version, is a wraith of unrequited longing, her twin blades the physical manifestation of a fractured psyche, a woman whose entire existence has been a slow, agonizing death in the shadow of a love that never belonged to her. Her duel with flying snow, conducted in a whirlwind of crimson and gold, is a maelstrom of displaced erotic energy. 2 women tearing at each other's bodies because they cannot tear at the heart of the man who has abandoned them both to the prison of his philosophical awakening. The king's laughter at the conclusion of Nameless' tale is a moment of shocking psychological violence, a sovereign's dismissal of a narrative that insults his intelligence by underestimating the stature of his enemies and the complexity of their motivations. His counter-narrative, the Blue Chapter, is an act of intellectual generosity disguised as a contest of wits, a tyrant granting his would-be assassin the dignity of a worthier story, even as he weaves the threads of that story into a noose for Nameless' true intentions. The blue color palette is an aesthetic sedative, a calming wash of azure and indigo that transforms the feverish, red passion of the previous chapter into a serene, melancholy meditation on duty, sacrifice, and the cold beauty of a noble death. The lake on which Nameless and Sky conduct their revised duel is a mirror of the cosmos, its placid surface reflecting the infinite sky and suggesting that this version of the story has ascended from the muddy, blood-soaked earth to a realm of pure, platonic forms. Their fight, a ballet of mutual consent, is a choreography of suicide, every movement a prearranged step in a dance that will conclude with Sky's graceful, willing descent into the eternal peace of martyrdom. The scroll, in this retelling, is a message in a bottle tossed across the ocean of enmity, a secret communication between Broken Sword and the king that reveals a clandestine philosophical alliance more potent than any military pact. The king's assertion that the 20th level of swordsmanship involves the transcendence of the sword itself is a moment of profound aesthetic kinship, a warrior king saluting a warrior artist across the chasm of their political opposition. Flying Snow's death in the blue version, a willing self-sacrifice at the hands of her lover, is a sublimation of erotic love into ideological commitment, the ultimate proof of devotion transformed from a private embrace into a public, political offering. The king's confession that even his version is incomplete is a moment of rare intellectual humility, an acknowledgement that the human heart contains chambers that even the most penetrating gaze of power cannot illuminate. The transition to the white chapter is a pilgrimage to the source, a stripping away of all chromatic adornment to reveal the skeletal truth beneath the beautiful, deceptive flesh of the preceding narratives. The White Desert is a landscape of metaphysical exposure, a place where the protective fictions of identity, nation, and personal grievance are scoured away by the abrasive wind, leaving only the naked, trembling soul confronting the infinite. The green flashback within the white truth is the film's Garden of Eden, a brief, luminous memory of a time when love was still possible, before the serpent of philosophy whispered the fatal idea of all under heaven into Broken Sword's ear. The infiltration of the Qin Palace in this flashback is a revelation of terrifying anticlimax. The revelation that the king's survival was never a matter of security, but of a choice made by a conscience wrestling with the angel of history. Broken Sword's epiphany in the throne room is the film's theological core, a moment of blinding revelation in which the face of the future is unveiled, and the assassin recognizes that his sword must be sheathed not in the body of the tyrant, but in the scabbard of a higher purpose. His characters written in the sand are a scripture of sand, a sacred text that accepts its own impermanence, a truth that will be blown away by the wind but will, in its brief existence, alter the trajectory of an empire. Nameless' transformation in the desert is a slow, painful exorcism, the demon of personal vengeance being drawn out of his body by the insistent, gentle pressure of Broken Sword's philosophy. His return to the Qin court is a descent from the mountaintop of enlightenment into the valley of political consequence, his body now a living scroll inscribed with the two characters that have rewritten his destiny. The 10 paces between him and the king are no longer a killing ground, but a sanctuary, a space of mutual recognition where the assassin and the tyrant meet not as enemies, but as co-authors of a future they will both pay for with their souls. His empty scabbard, raised as a final salute, is a weapon of transcendence, a blade that has been melted down and reforged into a concept, a sword that kills not the body of the king, but the endless cycle of vengeance that has devoured the land for centuries. The king's tears are the baptismal waters of a new era, the first genuine emotion he has permitted himself in a lifetime of armored vigilance, a grief for the man he must kill and a gratitude for the philosophy that has absolved him. His order to execute Nameless is the crucible in which the philosophy of all under heaven is tested and proven, the moment when the abstract ideal becomes concrete law, demanding the death of its own prophet to establish its impartial, terrible majesty. The wall of arrows that erases Nameless from the visual field is a signature of the state's ultimate authority, the same anonymous, industrial violence that destroyed the calligraphy school, now consecrating the body of the man who understood that destruction. The hero's funeral is a scene of profound, unsettling ambiguity, the state honoring the man it has murdered, the propaganda apparatus already at work transforming a complex philosophical sacrifice into a simplified, patriotic exemplum for mass consumption. Flying Snow's final walk across the white desert is a via dolorosa of irreducible grief, her figure a dark, bleeding wound on the immaculate body of the landscape, a reminder that the personal cannot be fully sublimated into the political. Her confrontation with Broken Sword is an accusation that philosophy is a form of betrayal, that the mind's constructions are a cold comfort to the heart that has been shattered on the altar of an abstraction. His suicide by her hand is the final, tragic proof of his love, a gift of his life offered in the recognition that no argument, however sublime, can heal the wound he has inflicted on the woman who loved him before he loved an idea. Her suicide, her body draped over his in the silent desert, is a reassertion of the eternal verities of the heart, a stubborn, magnificent refusal to accept that their love was merely a footnote in the grand narrative of national unification. The two bodies, entwined in the white void, form a countermonument to the official memorial of Nameless, a private, tragic sculpture that the state will never claim, a testament to a love that existed outside and against the logic of history. The return to the black palette for the coda is a reassertion of the state's chromatic monopoly, the brief, glorious rebellion of color now crushed back into the obsidian uniformity of the Qin aesthetic. The king, alone in his cavernous throne room, is a figure of absolute, metaphysical solitude, a man who has achieved everything and lost everything, his victory a crown of thorns that will press upon his brow for the remainder of his reign. The final image of the Great Wall, seen from an impossible godlike height, is a visual paradox, a structure that is both a wound and a suture, a scar on the landscape that is also the signature of a civilization, an enduring question posed in stone. The wall is the fossil of the philosophy the film has debated, the physical manifestation of all under heaven, and the camera's slow, majestic drift along its serpentine length is a final, wordless invitation to contemplate the cost of unity, a cost that is still being paid. Hero concludes not with an answer but with an image, a monument that stands outside the narratives, outside the colors, outside the arguments, a silent, stone witness to the terrible and beautiful truth that civilizations are built on the bones of both tyrants and heroes, and that history is the long, slow process of forgetting which is which. The pre-credit darkness from which Hero emerges is a primordial void, a cinematic formlessness that awaits the first divine command of the directors. Vision to separate light from shadow and meaning from chaos. The massive bronze cauldrons that flank the approaches to the Qin throne are not merely decorative vessels, but ritual containers of state memory, each one holding the metaphorical ashes of the conquered kingdoms that have been consumed by the insatiable digestive furnace of Qin ambition. The camera's slow, inexorable tracking movement through the palace is a visual inhalation, a gathering of oppressive atmosphere that fills the viewer's lungs with the cold, thin air of a world where mercy has been exiled and calculation reigns supreme. The anonymous messenger who first announces Nameless' arrival is a function devoid of personhood, a mouthpiece for a bureaucracy that has perfected the art of transforming human beings into the relay nodes of an impersonal information network. The king's posture on his throne is a masterpiece of sustained tension, a physical equipoise that suggests a coiled spring of potential violence held in check by a will of diamond, a man who has not relaxed his guard for a single moment in decades of rule. The decree that citizens of Zhao must remain an additional 10 paces distant is a cartography of hatred written into the spatial protocols of the court, a lingering residue of a specific, historical enmity that the king's paranoia has codified into ceremonial law. Nameless' advance through the concentric rings of security is a pilgrimage through the layers of state power, each permitted step a peeling back of the onion skin protections that encase the vulnerable, beating heart of the monarchy. The 3 boxes he carries are not containers but propositions, physical hypotheses that assert a reality so extraordinary that it requires an equally extraordinary narrative to render it digestible to the court's skeptical intelligence apparatus. The presentation of the weapons unfolds as a striptease of proof, each unveiled blade a shocking glimpse of a supposedly invincible legend now reduced to a silent, gleaming artifact on the cold stone floor of the conqueror's hall. The king's face, as he gazes upon the weapons of his enemies, is a palimpsest of conflicting emotions. The satisfaction of a threat eliminated, the melancholy of a worthy adversary lost, and the flickering suspicion that the entire scene is a beautifully baited trap. The narrative framework that the film adopts from this point forward is a chess game played with words instead of pieces, each story an opening gambit, a mid-game maneuver, or an endgame sacrifice designed to checkmate the opposing player's construction of reality. The color red, when it first saturates the screen, is a visceral assault on the senses, a chromatic scream that shatters the monochromatic discipline of the palace and releases a flood of repressed emotional energy that the gray world of state power cannot contain. The architecture of the gambling house in the red chapter is a labyrinth of desire, its layered curtains and shadowy alcoves a physical manifestation of the human psyche's darker corridors. where greed, lust, and the thirst for oblivion conduct their eternal, whispered transactions. Long Sky, as imagined by Nameless in this first fiction, is a noble savage of the martial arts, a warrior whose ferocity is untamed by philosophy, whose spear is an extension of a proud, unreflective will to power that the cunning of Qin can easily manipulate and defeat. The rain in their duel is not merely weather but a participant, each droplet a tiny lens that refracts and distorts the action, suggesting that this entire account is seen through a glass darkly, a version of events filtered through a medium of deliberate deception. The moment of Sky's defeat, his spear shattered and his body yielding to Nameless' superior technique, is staged as a triumph of intellect over brawn, the prefect's calm precision dismantling the warrior's passionate, unfocused fury with surgical elegance. The calligraphy school in the Red version is a sanctuary of fading idealism, a place where the old religion of art and culture makes its last stand against the new dispensation of steel and statecraft. The master calligrapher's gnarled hands, clutching his brush like a talisman, are the hands of a dying tradition, the physical vessels of a knowledge that will be buried with him when the Qin arrows complete their merciless, democratic harvest of Zhao's intellectual elite. The students who choose to remain and die with their master are not soldiers but martyrs of the word, their red robes the vestments of a priesthood that worships the character, the stroke, the ineffable power of the written signifier to outlast the flesh that inscribes it. The Red narrative's portrayal of Flying Snow as a creature of jealous rage is a defamation rooted in a patriarchal anxiety, the male imagination reducing a warrior of legendary prowess to a hysterical woman whose blade is guided not by principle but by the capricious storms of a wounded heart. Moon, the servant, is a phantom of pure pathos, a woman whose entire identity has been constructed around a love she can express only through service, a devotion so total that it has erased her capacity for independent existence. The leaves that swirl around her duel with Flying Snow are the scattered pages of an unwritten tragedy, each one a fragment of a story that will never be told, a grief that will never be articulated, a love that will never be requited. The king's interruption of this lurid melodrama is an act of literary criticism as much as political analysis, a monarch's disdainful rejection of a narrative that fails the test of psychological verisimilitude and aesthetic sophistication. His blue counter-narrative is a demonstration of state power's ability to produce not only weapons and laws but also stories, the ideological apparatus of the throne spinning a tale of such seductive nobility that it threatens to overwrite Nameless' account entirely. The azure palette of this chapter is a visual tranquilizer, a cooling of the blood that transforms the fevered, red rage of the previous story into a state of contemplative, almost mournful acceptance of the tragic necessities of history. The lake on which Nameless and Sky conduct their revised duel is a liquid stage where the laws of physics are suspended, a realm where warriors can float on the surface tension of their own will, untethered from the gross, material constraints of the terrestrial world. Their fight is a pas de deux of death, a choreographed suicide that transforms the brutal act of killing into a gesture of such exquisite grace that it transcends violence and enters the domain of pure, abstract art. Sky's body, sinking beneath the lake's surface, is a descent into the underworld of legend, a voluntary drowning in the waters of myth that will ensure his name survives the annihilation of his physical form. The scroll in the blue narrative is no longer a mere artwork, but a diplomatic cipher, its brushstrokes encoding a secret treaty between the king and Broken Sword, a pact of mutual recognition that bypasses the slow, clumsy channels of official negotiation. The king's exegesis of the scroll's hidden meaning is a performance of hermeneutic mastery, a demonstration that his power extends beyond the material realm into the semiotic, the ability to read the secret signs that others mistake for mere decoration. Flying Snow's willing sacrifice in the blue version is a troubling fantasy of female submission, the woman offering her life to enable the grand, masculine project of political assassination, her death a footnote in a story authored by men. The king's admission that his reconstruction is also incomplete is a crack in the edifice of omniscience, a moment of vulnerability that humanizes the tyrant and prepares the audience for the final, devastating revelations of the White chapter. The chromatic transition to the white truth is a visual purification, a washing away of the beautiful, seductive lies of red and blue to reveal the stark, unadorned skeleton of what actually transpired in the desert between Broken Sword and Nameless. The White Desert is a landscape of last things, an eschatological space where the final accounting of a life is rendered, where the masks of identity are stripped away by the abrasive wind and the soul stands exposed before the judgment of eternity. The green flashback that punctuates the white narrative is a memory of lost possibility, a glimpse of the verdant, living world that existed before the long, slow dying of the warring states period bleached everything to the color of bone. The infiltration of the Qin palace by broken sword and flying snow is revealed as the true, original assassination attempt, the primal scene that all subsequent narratives have been circling, evading, and defacing in their attempts to impose a manageable meaning on an unmanageable event. Broken Sword's paralysis in the throne room is not a failure of nerve, but a catastrophic success of vision. The sudden, horrifying ability to see the future that his blade would create. 100 more years of war, 1,000,000 more corpses, a chaos that would make the king's tyranny seem like a golden age of order. His decision to lower his sword is a betrayal of everything he was, everything he loved, and everything he believed, an act of such radical self-negation that it transforms him instantly from a hero of Zhao into a ghost haunting the margins of a history he has chosen to enable rather than prevent. The characters he traces in the sand are the seeds of a new world, fragile ideograms that the desert wind will erase, but that have already taken root in the soil of nameless consciousness, where they will grow into the tree of a terrible, necessary decision. Nameless absorption of Broken Sword's philosophy is not a moment of sudden conversion, but a slow, painful education. The prefect's mind being reshaped by the master calligrapher of ideology until his old certainties crumble and a new, awful clarity takes their place. His return to the Qin palace is a descent into the valley of the shadow of political necessity, his body a living sacrifice that walks willingly towards the altar of state power, knowing that his blood will be the mortar that binds the bricks of the unified empire. The 10 paces that separate him from the king are now a Via Dolorosa, each step a station of the cross on a path that leads not to glory but to a forgotten, anonymous grave outside the city walls. His empty scabbard, held before him as he kneels, is an offering of peace, a sword that has been unmade, a weapon that has been transformed into a symbol, a blade that kills by choosing not to kill. The king's tears, as he receives this offering, are the waters of a second birth, the tyrant being baptized into a new understanding of his own role. No longer merely a conqueror, but the reluctant, tragic instrument of a unity that requires the blood of heroes to consecrate its foundations. His order to execute Nameless is the final, brutal proof that the law of all under heaven is no respecter of persons, that the machine of state must crush even its most enlightened servants to maintain the cold, impartial logic that alone can hold the realm together. The arrows that erase Nameless from the gate are a signature of the state's ultimate authorship, writing the final, definitive version of his story in the ink of his own blood. A version that will be inscribed in the official chronicles and recited by schoolchildren for millennia. The hero's funeral is a ceremony of myth-making, the raw, complex, agonized reality of nameless sacrifice being processed by the propaganda apparatus into a simplified, sanitized, and politically useful fable of loyalty to the throne. Flying Snow's final journey across the White Desert is a protest against this official story, a mute, moving testimony to the existence of a truth that the chronicles will never record, a love that the state can never canonize. Her accusation that Broken Sword's philosophy is a poison is the cry of the particular against the universal, the scream of the individual heart against the crushing weight of a historical necessity that reduces persons to principles and loves to footnotes. His death at her hands is the last, desperate gift of a man who has betrayed his lover for an idea and now offers his life as a pathetic, inadequate reparation for a wound that no philosophy can heal. Her suicide is a victory of the personal over the political, a stubborn, magnificent refusal to accept the logic of sacrifice, a final, definitive statement that some things, love, grief, the irreplaceable singularity of a human bond, are not negotiable, not redeemable, not subsumable into any grand narrative of national destiny. The two bodies, entwined in the white sand, are a monument to a counter-history, a narrative of the heart that exists in eternal, silent opposition to the official narrative of the state, a testament that will be buried by the wind but never entirely forgotten. The return to the black palette for the coda is a reassertion of the state's chromatic dominance, the brief, glorious rebellion of color having been crushed back into the obsidian uniformity of the only story that will survive the story, told by the victors. The king, alone in his throne room, is a figure of absolute cosmic solitude, a man who has won the world and lost every soul that might have made the victory meaningful, his crown a circle of fire that isolates him from the common warmth of human connection. The final image of the Great Wall is a visual koan, an insoluble paradox that the film offers to the audience as a parting gift, a structure that is both a wonder and a wound, a monument to both the highest aspirations and the most brutal realities of the civilization it represents. The wall snakes across the mountains like a dragon of stone, and the camera's slow, majestic drift along its spine is a final, wordless meditation on the cost of unity, a cost that is measured not in gold or grain but in the countless, nameless bodies that form the invisible foundation of every great and terrible human achievement.